Well, right, it's 10:30 p.m. here in South Korea, and I'd like to welcome everyone for joining us today to this exciting session called Investing in Nature. How can we get nature on the private investment agenda for a green recovery? We've nearly got 300 and more participants joining us today, so I think we might get started. My name is Verónica Galmez, and I will be moderating today's session. First, I really want to thank you all for joining us today. I really believe that this is such an important conversation to re-energize action for 2021. The pandemic has definitely highlighted the connections, the interlinkages between the health of people and the health of nature, of our natural ecosystems. And what has been definitely an inspiration for this session is the momentum that is building around the global biodiversity agenda. If I can share with you perhaps 3 key messages from the UN Biodiversity Summit that was held 2 weeks ago. First, that nature-based solutions need to be embedded in COVID-19 recovery and wider development plans. Second, that our economic systems and financial markets really need to account for and invest in nature. And third, that we really must secure the most ambitious policies and targets for protecting biodiversity while leaving no one behind. What I think is particularly promising is the traction that we are now getting from the investment community, as it is making progress in trying to find new and innovative financial ways to really catalyze private investment for nature-based solutions. We all know that nature, unfortunately, continues to be undervalued in the financial and in the economic markets. And actually Build Back Better is giving us this additional chance to really address the climate and the biodiversity emergency, while also trying to respond to closing this gap between the intention and the action. We are really excited today to bring together a group of experts and change makers. We have 5 wonderful change makers with us here today. And we are actually super excited because they are moving the needle in nature investment. We look forward to hearing on their insights on how to bring scale to these solutions. Now we are around 350 people with us on the line, and we want you to be an active audience. So if you have any question, if you have any comment, please, we invite you to submit your question in the Q&A chat that is available in the Huoba window. We expect to address some of those questions after the panel discussion. One additional practical point before we start with the panel is that live remote interpretation to Spanish and French is also available during the session. Now, today's panel discussion will last 90 minutes, 1 hour and a half, and we aim to have an interactive discussion with 5 wonderful guests. Catherine, Hans, Simon, Michael, and Martin, thank you very much for being with us today. And to kick us off, we are actually going to start with Catherine. Catherine Stadulka, she is leading the Blended Finance Task Force at Systemic. Systemic is an impact investment and advisory firm that is now focusing on system change and sustainability. So welcome, Catherine, and thank you very much for being with us today. I really want you to help us to set the scene and to really explain which are the key global trends in nature-based solutions finance, and which are these emerging markets for investing in nature. Catherine, you have 6 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and to everyone for being on the line. I know some of you, it's very, very late, and I think this just shows really the first trend, Veronica, which is nature is now on the agenda. if we're looking at sort of silver linings of COVID, I think that the link between human economic behaviour and our impact on nature has been so clearly put into relief this year. The first trend that we're really seeing is that this is no longer a conversation for the tree huggers of the world, for the NGOs, for the climate funds. This is a private sector discussion, and that really begins with risk, Veronica. When we think about the exposure that we've seen even earlier this year in my country, Australia, of huge fires, and the crisis that creates when you're seeing, 11 million hectares getting burned, emitting 250 million tonnes of CO2. That's almost half of Australia's annual emissions, by the way. But what that has actually done is, it's not 0.5% of Australia's GDP for Q1. It meant that Sweden's central bank dumped Australian treasury bonds due to climate risk. It costs the country billions of dollars. And so we're starting to see the economic impact of nature-related risk really coming out. And of course, COVID provides another really obvious example of that. The infectious diseases linked to environmental degradation and destruction being so well known to everyone on this call. And so that's the second trend, Veronica. It's that people are starting to put this story together. They're saying to build a strong economy, we also need to have a strong environment, and an environment which is not only sort of just planet friendly, but also people friendly. All of these stats you will know, but I'll just go through them so that you have them at your fingertips. But the World Economic Forum recently found that if countries and businesses prioritise nature, they can be generating over $10 trillion in annual business value. That can create nearly 400 million jobs by the end of 2030, and jobs are such a critical part of this agenda given the impact of COVID on the world this year. If we think that half the world's GDP is linked to nature, this is a conversation which must be had not only with policymakers, but also with investors. And I think we're really lucky today to have Martin on the line, who can tell us more about the exciting HSBC fund that's just been launched. We've got people, we've got Hans from Rabobank, who's been pioneering, sustainable agriculture for such a long time. We've got Simon and Michael, who are at the forefront of these blended finance vehicles. And that's the kind of the third trend, Veronica. It's really that we are seeing solutions starting to come to the forefront. Nature positive investment vehicles, environmentally friendly funds, a lot of money pouring into ESG products and sustainability linked products, which are planet positive. And that's really exciting. Between 2015 and 2017, I think the average was around 10 billion a year into biodiversity finance. But if you think that there's a funding gap for biodiversity of around $700 billion a year for the next decade, we are absolutely falling short. And maybe that's where the next trend comes in, which is about opportunity. Often we're finally getting the what and the why. We know that we need to invest in nature because it reduces risk, because it can create value. We know that investors are interested. Simon particularly will have seen the recent findings from the Responsible Investor Report, which said 90% of asset managers would be keen to invest in the oceans, but they just don't know how to do it. They don't know which markets that they should be looking at. They don't know what the pipeline looks like or if it's high value enough. And so this conversation is really shifting from getting money out of the bad stuff, so deforestation linked or degradation linked finance, and into the good stuff. How do we actually develop the new assets, the new nature positive assets of the future? Because without that, we are seeing almost a mismatch in the ambition from the private sector and from investors, from their interest in nature positive investment and their ability to actually deploy capital. And if we think, looking at getting money out of the bad and into the good, that really means we've got to be creative. We've got to look at new revenue streams. Carbon is an obvious one, but also new technologies, alternative proteins, regenerative agriculture. There are, I think, there's a lot more innovation on the product side and on the specific business model side than we necessarily realise. But that also requires some risk mitigation. And as I said, you know, we really do have the experts on the line today in this concept of using development capital catalytically to crowd in the private sector. I mean, the GCF, obviously, Michael with the Anti-Green Fund and the Norwegian funding there, Hans, obviously, Agri3 and the Dutch funding that mitigates risks in those blended finance vehicles. It is, and Martin, before, you know, being at the EIB, obviously this was your bread and butter, but using the development funding available, and particularly stimulus now, to mitigate private sector risk and perception of private sector risk, as well as developing high quality pipeline and aggregating assets so that they are at an investable scale and that they represent investable opportunities for private investors is key. I mean, your last question, Veronica, around, you know, the markets to invest in. If we're looking at emerging markets and we're looking at nature, it is absolutely at that tropical forest frontier. Across the tropical belt, there are huge opportunities for nature positive investments. We're seeing pioneering solutions happening across the value chain, you know, right from incubating regenerative business models all the way up to, you know, financial products that are interesting to institutional investors. But we don't get there unless we have the right corporate and supply chain partnerships, and unless we have the right financial partnerships as well. So that last trend, Veronica, and I'm sure I've run over my time, but I think it really is about figuring out how we streamline those partnerships. Because if we keep trying to reinvent the wheel, if we keep trying to launch new bespoke subscale nature positive funds or products, then we really don't meet that $700 billion biodiversity funding gap. You guys at the GCF do this for a living as well, and figuring out how to ensure that access to catalytic capital can happen in a streamlined way and can be deployed in a streamlined way with the right partnerships with corporates and governments and communities. That's key. So I'll just end on that, Veronica, and it is to say that this whole narrative about investing in nature is about nature, our natural environment, biodiversity, protecting from the sixth extinction of species, but it's also about people. This is about resilient jobs, about avoiding migration, about tackling climate injustice, because ultimately the most exposed communities are those who are least responsible for climate change and also going to be the ones most badly affected by it. To create viable economic opportunities for those communities as well is our responsibility when we talk about investing in nature. So thanks for having me today, and really looking forward to this panel.
Thank you, Catherine. That was wonderful. Thank you very much. It's great to hear about these global trends, which are actually showing us this action-oriented, and definitely it also shows a positive panorama. We see that there are tangible and exciting opportunities out there, and we just need to understand which are the avenues, which are the right avenues to get engaged with these opportunities. I would like to highlight the relevance of the word partnership that you used. And I also would like to highlight that nature is already in the agenda, as you mentioned, and that this is now a private sector discussion. You talked about oceans, about the relevance of forests, and that half of the world's GDP relies on nature. Thank you very much, Catherine, and I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. Now, I would like to go to my second panelist today, Hans. Hans, thank you very much for being with us today. Hans Loth is leading the United Nations Environment Partnership at Rabobank, and he is responsible for building and managing the bank's new strategic partnership. Hans, from the banking system perspective, and I remember well when we met last year in Luxembourg, you mentioned that if we really want to achieve scale, we really need to change some of the enablers that are out there. Could you please tell us what are these changes that are occurring now in the banking system to sustain the businesses that are anchored in nature-based solutions? Hans, over to you.
Yes, well, thank you, Veronica. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Yeah, that indeed we spoke at the Global Landscapes program in Luxembourg last year in November on stage, and I was thinking about that leading up to this panel discussion today, and it was pre-COVID. And we were having a discussion about scale and the obvious public-private leverage that needs to happen, looking at the funding gap that Catherine was alluding to already, which is huge. For the record, Rabobank, together with UN Environment and FMO and IDH, set up a fund where we start with 1 billion. But if you hear the numbers on the funding gap that we need, those are mind-boggling. So partnership is indeed the word. We need to team up together. To answer your question, Veronica, when we talked about scale and public-private leverage and what needs to happen going forward, for sure we need to rope in more commercial banks. For sure we need to rope in more corporates as a client base. I mentioned specifically COVID because it did have an impact on life as we know it, and we all are living it, but also on banks and the reality that banks are facing, which is also lending and risk management. And Catherine mentioned just now, together with funding gap, another important element, which is risk. So what we see now in the banking landscape is a situation where we deal with COVID from a risk management perspective, but also, and that's on a positive note, a leadership trend amongst banks, obviously front runners out there like BNP, HSBC, that say, listen, we are aware of the situation today, short term, midterm, long term. We are convinced that we need to come out of COVID-19 in a more sustainable fashion, where we need to work towards food transition and system transition to protect nature, which is important, and it's key that that leadership stays there. The leadership is important. I highlight the leadership because in the short run, the numbers might be all over the place. So you do need to take that long-term perspective to say, listen, we as a bank see our role in society together with our client base, and we want to take that role going forward and support public-private leverage, where indeed, as Catherine mentioned, we need that concessional part of funding to de-risk part of the private capital risk out there. That is no doubt there, so that we can attract even more private capital. That's a big opportunity. And I think in a way, the silver lining is indeed that it's become more clear that we will need to take that mid and long-term perspective because COVID-19 just proves we need to work our way through it and beyond and have a more sustainable way of banking. Another important element that I see since November last year is PACTA, which is a partnership of banks looking at, okay, not only leadership for making our assets more green, but also the methodologies. How are we going to put that into our models? How will we align methodologies to make that happen? Because banks, as you will appreciate, operate in a regulated environment. And what they also like, especially when you look at scale, is standardization. And unfortunately, looking at environmental and social impact, that is not there yet. So some of the banks are taking that role again, in a leadership fashion to say, okay, we'll take that on board, and we'll start to talk to our regulator. We'll start to talk to each other where we align on those methodologies, because for impact, that's required. So I see a few challenges out there looking at the short-term perspective. Mid to long-term perspective, I see banks coming up, taking the leadership, and Martin no doubt will allude to that and showcase HSBC's effort on that front as well. And also like to highlight, Veronica, that indeed partnership is key here. We need to learn from each other. We are also learning from Michael and his team, and Green. We're working together with Mirova, so Simon can speak to that as well. And some of the people in the panel and in the audience have been in impact finance for years, maybe even decades. What we seek as a bank, because we're fairly new to this game, is to learn from partners that have been around for some time already. And there's unique pockets of knowledge. And what I see as part of my job is to support unleashing that, teaming up, networking, prevent reinventing the wheel, because some wheels have been invented already. And for that, partnership is key. So looking forward to the further discussion in this panel and the audience, and to see if we can come up with some common calls to action. Back to you, Veronica.
Thank you very much, Hans. It is really inspiring to hear how the banking system can really appreciate the green transition, and how the banks are actually key to help deliver and address the current deficiencies to sustain nature-based actions. You also mentioned risks in the banking system, and the new connotation of risks under COVID-19 context. Hans, you also mentioned the importance of having de-risking partners, and I will tell you that this is definitely where the GCF has a role to play. Today's session is about how to get nature on the private investment agenda, and of course this brings to our attention not only the land-based ecosystems, but also the oceans and marine ecosystems, and that's why we have Simon today. Simon Dent is leading the Sustainable Ocean Fund in Mirova Natural Capital and the investment committee of the fund. Thank you very much, Simon, for being with us today. Simon, the oceans seem to be an undervalued asset compared to conservation efforts around other land-based natural capital. Could you please tell us how can investors help improve the health of our oceans while promoting marine-focused investments? Over to you, Simon.
Sure, thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So good afternoon and good evening, and I guess also good morning. So it's really exciting to have a global audience. So yes, I'm Simon Danson, principal of the Sustainable Ocean Fund, which is now managed by Mirova Natural Capital. Mirova is an investment manager with over $8 billion of dedicated sustainable investment, really looking at a mandate by combining long-term value creation with sustainable development. And so, but I'm here today to talk about the oceans. And so, yes, the answer is the oceans are indeed an undervalued asset, and increasingly an undervalued economic opportunity. So we know that the ocean encompasses over 70% of the planet, but it has an estimated asset base of more than $24 trillion. I mean, the annual global fish catch is worth more than 85 billion. And more than 10 billion is made from ocean-related ecotourism. And crucially, to our climate, it processes over 50% of the oxygen that we breathe. So every second breath you take comes from the ocean. And it absorbs roughly a quarter of the CO2 globally. But we also have 5 times more carbon sits within coastal mangroves than it does within forests. And then from a food security point of view, we have 3 billion people providing more than 20% of their protein coming from fish. And 1 billion or more people depend on the ocean as their primary source. the demand is expected to grow by more than 50%. So by 2030, we will see the pressure on the ocean to feed the population grow substantially. So basically, we have an ocean that is providing life on Earth, but all the way from a microscopic algae all the way to a blue whale. And in fact, for a sustainable planet, we must have a healthy ocean. But however, to date, and as we've suggested in the question, there's very little conservation finance being pushed towards the ocean. In fact, it's been heavily weighted historically to forestry, to renewables, other forms of impact investing. We estimate that roughly 1% of conservation capital has found its way to supporting the oceans at any level. We need to redress the balance, and investors need to use the same investment logic that they look on terrestrial impact investing and apply that to the ocean. So this is what we've been doing. So over the last 4 years, the Sustainable Ocean Fund team have worked hard with our partners to demonstrate that there are significant investable opportunities in the ocean. The fund is deployed or is working on transactions that are worth more than $70 million today. And we are supported as a fund both by development banks and large institutional investors. So we know that there's an interest by investors to invest in the ocean. We are investing into scalable models that provide a sustainable business opportunity. And we're doing it in sustainable seafood, we're doing it in the circular economy, and we're looking at the conservation sectors. We've made investments into aquaculture, plastics, waste recycling, technologies to address bycatch. We're looking at ecotourism and marine protected areas. So we do believe that there's a wealth of investable opportunities in the ocean. Investors do need to realign some of their capital flows to take this new sector on board. Some cases we may need to adjust the risk return profile as well. But we also need to understand that most investments that affect the ocean actually occur on land. So, nearly 80% of plastic and waste actually occurs, that hit the ocean actually comes from land. And if we're looking at trying to help small-scale farmers, small-scale fishers, basically we can do that most effectively by making investments into land-based processing and cold chains. And so this is the important point to take on board, that you're not investing into a difficult environment on water, you're mainly investing on the land to cause the effect in the chains. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon. That was super interesting. Keeping the marine ecosystems healthy is definitely essential for enhancing climate resilience, but also for constraining carbon emissions. It's interesting also to see the different opportunities already there for financial innovation. We will have time to see concrete action and concrete experiences in our second round. These actions need to be, of course, tailored to the particularities of the business models related to the marine and ocean ecosystems. Now, of course, bringing scale and the depth needed for the transformational change, it's also about how to realign and how to reorient finance. And in the land use area, this, of course, includes targeting those drivers of ecosystem degradation and particularly deforestation. So Michael is our next panelist. Michael Schlupp is partner and managing director at Sail Ventures, which is an investment also advisor to the End Green Fund. Thank you very much, Michael, for being with us today. Could you please tell us what is the financing and practice gap that needs to be filled for a real deforestation-free commodity production? Over to you, Michael.
Thank you so much, Veronica. Thank you so much to all the previous speakers, and good day to you all in the audience. Thanks for the opportunity. And I think what I'd like to do in my short intervention is I would like to kind of explain to you what we are, and you know, why we are needed, and how we go about you know, financing projects that actually help reduce deforestation. And then finally, and most importantly, I think, how we can get this to scale. Because I think, you know, scale, and you've mentioned it, Veronica, scale is the key to actually have impact, particularly when you talk about the value chains, the supply chains that we're working in. So, and Green, that's the fund we manage, is a real blended finance fund. So that means it has public and private sector investors. The government of Norway and the Global Environment Facility have invested in the fund, and Unilever is our private sector investor. We're focusing on the tropical forest commodities, so that's soy, beef, palm oil, and, you know, forestry products. That could be rubber, could also be cocoa, coffee, you know, and we're trying to make commercial investments in this space that really kind of shift these value chains, shift these supply chains from being unsustainable to, you know, from being essentially extractive industries to being regenerative, to being sustainable, to achieve zero deforestation. So typically, we work with larger actors. We kind of complement, in a way, as a fund, we complement smaller funds that, you know, invest in innovative impact. We're focusing on the large supply chain actors, plantation companies, supply chain companies, could even invest in banks. And, you know, we're providing the capital to those willing companies that want to shift the supply chain, but really can't find the capital that is needed for seeing this transformation through. So, you know, we're working, typically we're additionally coming in as an investor that takes long-term risk. We're de-risking other investors at the project level. So we're not a layered fund in the sense that we have, you know, different types of investors in the fund. We all have long-term investors in the fund. The way we're doing this is essentially by finding those projects that, you know, where we have a willing counterparty, but, you know, we then invest. We then find the kind of leverage point through which the company can achieve transformation. A good example is a recent investment we have done in a cattle farm, a very large cattle farm in Brazil, where we have invested in transforming cattle farm into a farm that integrates cattle ranching with soy production. The soy production basically provides an additional revenue stream, so it's a great economic project for the company. It allows them to run more cattle on the same land, and at the same time it reduces CO2 emissions by half. Now the company can't access financing for this to date, because this is an 8-year project to transform the entire farm, a number of 10,000 hectares, more than 10, you know, a couple 10,000 hectares. Transforming that farm over time, you know, is an 8-year project, and there's just no financing available in Brazil for that. So, you know, we come in, we de-risk the commercial bank that typically banks this company, and, you know, together we're achieving this transformation of this farm towards a much more sustainable and also economically much more interesting project. And, you know, the objective of all of this is really to create a blueprint for other investors. The objective is to create a blueprint for institutional investors to see that, you know, with the right risk management tools, with the right kind of like management techniques for managing the impact and for managing the change, you can actually achieve decent returns, you know, commercially risk-adjusted returns, and at the same time, you can actually achieve impact. So we're kind of treating both impact and returns at the same level, and we're tracking both. We're being very transparent about that also. So if you want to go to our website and have a look how we report that, but the idea really is to make it clear that, you know, these investment opportunities exist, and these investment opportunities are attractive, and, you know, ultimately make us obsolete as a fund, and have institutional investors, private investors coming in and take over. And that, I think, is the big pot of gold at the end of the rainbow that we all should strive for. and that's very much why we are here today, I hope.
Thank you very much, Michael, for giving us concrete examples for de-risking investment in the forest and land use area. This is actually what our audience is asking for now: concrete examples, concrete action. And I totally agree with you. Deforestation-free supply chains can have an enormous climate mitigation impact. But most importantly, this approach can actually also change the way companies produce and build their entire value chains. And I would also like to add and perhaps to highlight the importance of information disclosure to really increase transparency in commodity supply chain. Thank you very much, Michael, for that. And we constantly need to build new investment ideas and new financial approaches to protect nature and conserve biodiversity. And Martin, you are our fifth panelist today. Martin Berg is partner at Pollination. Thank you very much for being with us today. Pollination is a specialist climate change advisory and investment firm that is actually accelerating the transition to a net zero climate resilient future. Martin, while of course the global economy is shifting with the pandemic and the race to decarbonize the assets intensifies, Pollination has now identified a growing demand for nature-based solutions to climate change. Could you please tell us what is actually Pollination currently doing in this endeavor? Over to you, Martin.
Thank you very much, Veronica, and hello everybody. Good morning, good evening, good day, wherever you are. Yes, I think it's difficult to come in as a last person because a lot of the things that I would have mentioned already said. But maybe I come a little bit from well, I give a little bit our take on a few things that have already been said. And I think the one thing is really there is definitely a growing momentum for natural capital, and I would absolutely agree that this has been supported by COVID-19. I mean, by 19, there's a lot of rethinking has happened in the time, but actually, similar to Hans, I think actually we already detected this trend much earlier. So I joined Pollination. Pollination is actually just a very new company, which is existing for a year. So I joined earlier this year. The last year I was still employed by the European Investment Bank. But even there, I could see we've been working at the EIB for more than 6-7 years already on natural capital. We were managing a natural capital financing facility for the European Commission. We invested in a lot of smaller vehicles that in the beginning didn't call in themselves that they were focused on natural capital. They were just trying to find alternatives way to address certain environmental issues. But what we never really seen is that large-scale investors seem to be interested in this. And even before the crisis, I could detect that trend. So we've seen I had quite a few investors actually calling me and saying, look, there's something about this natural capital and we try to understand it. And then the first time I was like, well, that's interesting, but I wouldn't have expected that. But it happened twice, and then it happened a third time. And I was like, wow, there's something there. There's something really a shift. And I think this is now, and as said, COVID has really probably accelerated this process very significantly. But when you see there's a lot of action at the moment. We're looking at business for nature, which have 560 companies, 4 trillion revenues that are now focusing on nature. We have finance for nature. There are 26 financial institutions, including HSBC. They're also now really looking at this. And the interesting part is, and this is why I like also Catherine's introduction. I think they're looking at probably very much at the moment from the risk side, much more than from the opportunity side. I think what's interesting on nature, what I personally find interesting is it lends itself much more to the risk side. And COVID has highlighted this very, very drastically to many companies that they actually have to be much more aware what role nature plays in their supply chain, in their balance sheets. And I think this is a real process that is now accelerating. We're seeing now there's a whole process being launched with the informal working group to see whether a task force on nature-related financial disclosure could be launched. And I think it's a very interesting process. We as HSBC Pollination are also part in this informal working group and trying to think through in what direction this actually should be done. But so that I always like this risk approach seems to be much more intuitive. I think where the challenges really start is how can we see a nature-related investment as opportunity, and I think for let's say large-scale investors, the real difficulty is it's actually twofold in my opinion. Everybody has mentioned the lack of scale, but I think that's probably one of the key issues, and that is there is no real scalable investment product at the moment for institutional investors when you look at nature. There are lots of fund opportunities to invest or smaller vehicles to invest. But if you're a large-scale investor saying my minimum investment size is maybe more than 100 million per investment, then it's extremely difficult to invest because, for example, in Simon's fund, you would probably have to invest alone nearly in the fund. And that's very challenging for some of those investors because they think, no, we don't want to do that. We maybe want to be 10%. So you see a magnitude of investments that are required that is still not matched at the moment by the underlying market. So at Pollination, I think one of the first things we always thought, okay, how can we bring this investment theme, natural capital, how can we bring this to the next level, and what is required in order to make this work? And I think one of the key challenges, and it's also been mentioned by many of my co-speakers here, is that natural capital is inherently undervalued. And again, that lends itself very nicely when you look on the risk side, because you can say, okay, I have to identify where it's undervalued and I have to pay attention to it. But when you actually then try to build an investment strategy around it, that is extremely difficult. So I think what needs to, in a way, and where we have been doing a lot of thinking in Pollination, and we'll speak later on about our JV with HSBC, is really how can we describe this investment theme, natural capital, or how can we link it to something that is more understandable to investors and that relies on revenue streams that are much more, let's say, much more traditional than a lot of the revenue streams we're seeing in particular in some of the smaller investment vehicles which are linked to nature-based solutions or payment for ecosystem service, for which there are very little markets at the moment. So I think this is actually an opportunity when you look at how we look at the investment scale landscape at the moment. That we're seeing, as I said, there are lots of the impact-focused funds that are lacking the scale, and then there are larger investors that look into forestry, into agriculture, and they very much embrace ESG as we see it at the moment. But what they don't probably use at the moment is really to look nature as an investment theme, and also use the impact side to create value. So we think, and this is where we believe a lot of the investors are actually working out, that in the middle of that there is something to be there in order to create larger scale investment themes. And the interesting part is this is not only then, and lots of investors do not necessarily have to look at this opportunistically, saying this is a really an investment opportunity, but it can also serve, and that's another thing that we believe really resonates with a lot of investors, as a natural hedge. Because we do see a lot of large-scale investors have investment portfolios that are very carbon intensive. A lot of them try to get out of that, but it's very difficult if they had acquired this for a long time ago. So if we could actually describe nature then as an investment that has an opportunity to also appreciate when actually the assets are valued in the correct way, when its undervaluation goes away. If investors understand that, then we believe there is a real good investment story. So I'll leave it here for the moment.
Thank you very much, Martin. If I can mention, perhaps, that you said COVID has definitely highlighted that companies need to be aware of the role nature plays, that there are currently lots of opportunities to invest now in small vehicles, and that what you identify is this mismatch between the opportunities for investment and the large scale investment schemes. Perhaps we can continue discussing in the second round. Now, Catherine, I'd like to go back to you. So far, we've heard about a wide array of financial players. There is a place for regulators, different types of institutional investors. There is a role of the financial system to really accelerate the transition to drive a nature positive economy. So with this challenging setting in mind, there is, of course, a particular role of climate finance. I would like to ask you, how does Systemic see climate finance playing a role for nature protection, for nature conservation?
Yeah, thanks so much, Veronica. And maybe I can answer it sort of walking through almost what Systemic does and how it uses its impact capital to play into this space, because I think we can get sometimes lost talking about these big concepts, you know, climate finance, development finance, and unless we actually talk about, you know, what's the money going into and what technologies are we needing to see, we never connect, maybe the rubber never hits the road, if you will. And so, I mean, as an overarching comment, I think we are starting to see much more integration of this concept of climate and nature. I mean, Martin mentioned the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, and reconciling TNFD with TCFD when people are sort of already grappling with their exposure to climate risk is really important, especially for sort of sectors like the food and ag space. You know, I think we used to talk about climate and we used to talk about ESG, and most people would think of a wind farm. They wouldn't necessarily think of, you know, their big agricultural portfolios or other land use assets. And so I think it is really exciting to see a shift in the way that nature and climate are sort of slowly converging in the same conversations, but also quite important again, to go on that journey with investors, both talking about, you know, risk mitigation, how nature-based solutions are a natural hedge, as Martin said, how they can be part of net zero commitments as well. I think part of that huge momentum, which both Hans and Martin talked about pre-COVID, was really being driven by this race to net zero, and understanding how natural solutions fit into that will be critical. But I also think it's important in these conversations to disaggregate the type of money. We can't talk about climate finance as one big bucket, because it's not. You've heard from Michael, you've heard from Hans, you've heard from Simon, you've heard from Martin, and all of that money is different, same as Systemic. You know, we help early stage regenerative businesses across the tropical belt, so from Indonesia to Colombia to Ghana, actually try and create value where otherwise you're going to have a huge incentive to play into the destructive or the extractive economy. I really liked that language from Michael there, sort of saying, how do we shift out of the land use sector from being extractive to regenerative? When you think about degraded land, for example, you know, the opportunities seem pretty limited, but in Indonesia, one of the amazing sort of companies that we work with there, called Kemiri Sunan, actually tackles this sort of 24 million hectares of degraded land in Indonesia, and says there's a particular type of crop that you can grow, which not only is native, which regenerates the land, which creates resilient jobs, but it also provides an alternative, I think, to some of these more destructive or extractive crops. Similarly, I think we can be bold when we talk about the type of capital that gets spent on technology. So another investment that Systemic recently made was into Jupiter Intelligence. And what they do is look very, very I guess uniquely at high resolution physical climate risks. And for the fire example that I mentioned earlier, if you're able to support corporates or governments by predicting, looking forward to a high level of granularity where you're going to have fire or flood or extreme heat exposure, suddenly you're able to shift the way that you spend capital so that you reduce that risk, but that you're also able to play into opportunities which you know, start to again bring climate risk and nature related risk together. I think I've probably, as always, over egged on the time allocated, but I really just want to say, Veronica, as well, the last thing that we really see as critical when we're talking about climate finance, nature related finance, is capacity building with emerging market governments. There is no nature-based solution unless we look at the tropical belt. There's no nature-based solution unless we're talking about, you know, coastal regions, which Simon will know better than anyone else. This doesn't happen. We don't get these investments and this pipeline unless we are looking at high carbon landscapes and, you know, nature positive ecosystems, whether it's in the oceans or on land. And so how we match the capacity building and community building challenge in these critical countries and critical ecosystems with those needs of institutional capital and making sure that we suddenly have products as well which are at the right scale. That's a challenge for all of us. That's a challenge for GCF and the other sort of climate funds as well, to use public money really catalytically to package up projects, to build capacity and to de-risk, to mobilize private capital. But I think it's everything to play for. So I'm positive, but I know there's a lot of work to do.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Catherine. Definitely, it's super important to distinguish the type of capital, especially also considering that nature-based solutions can provide, 30% of the required effort to achieve the Paris Agreement goals. Totally agree with you. Hans, I'd like to come back to you. I really believe that the audience would like to learn more about the ongoing partnership between the UN Environment and Rabobank. Could you please tell us what is the progress since the partnership started 3 years ago? Also considering that the Agri3 fund is now operational, what are these 3 dimensions that the Agri3 fund is contemplated? Hans, could you please tell us more about it?
Yeah, sure, Veronica, I'd be happy to. When Rabobank looked at its strategy 5 years back, it looked at the tagline, and we still use that a lot, is growing a better world together. As you know, that Rabobank has quite a portfolio in food and agriculture, and noticed that for growing a better world together towards a more sustainable agriculture that balances with nature and climate, we need to look at systemic access to finance for farmers. Because when we look at climate change, nature investments, that's by design a supply chain effort. But the upstream part of each supply chain, i.e. the farmer at the farm gate, does not seem to have systemic access to finance, which is a problem if you want to innovate. And that's a problem if you want to go to a food system transition. Because without money, there's nothing to innovate or transit to. You basically do need that money. And that's where banks come in, and that's where the infamous public-private leverage comes in. But as we discussed earlier today, for banks and other private entities, it is quite difficult to go beyond a proven business case. So we do need some public capital for a proof of concept time gap. And that's why we're here today, and I'll also explain a little bit how we factor that into Agri3. Because we also realized that when you look at financing farmers within the current regulated environment for banks, that is very difficult to do for many technical reasons that I will save for another day. So we had to look for an entity outside the bank. So we had to incorporate a fund outside the bank, which is Agri3, which we did indeed incorporate with UN, Environment, FMO, IDH, and investment manager is Mirova. So happy that Simon is here today. So it is indeed a separate body outside the bank, which is important to note. So we do need that fund for it to receive the blended finance, which is why we're extremely happy and proud that we were able to lock in this year the Dutch government funding. And we're also talking to the Global Environmental Facility. So we're in a way, as Martin also mentioned, a new kid on the block. So we started somewhere spring this year, and it's been an interesting ride. So within AGI3 Fund, we have several layers of capital, and one of them is indeed donor funding. Together with that, we have a technical assistance fund, because money is not always the magic bullet to all challenges out there. So what does AGI3 do in effect? To keep it very simple, banks find it risky to lend to farmers. That's just a fact. They cannot model it, they don't like it. We've talked enough about risk today. So we thought, how can we help solve that rather than talk about it? So AGI3 actually de-risks parts of loans that go beyond the risk appetite of banks. So there's always that tenor, the length of a loan that is standard practice within a bank. But for a food system transition, you do need a longer tenor. So AGI3 takes that first, middle, or last part and de-risks it. Provides, in effect, to keep it simple, a guarantee to another bank so that that bank can lend to the farmer, and the farmer can be active in food system transition and innovate its farming practices, i.e. invest together in a better climate and a more diverse nature. So that's in essence how it works. We de-risk parts of loans. Where we are fairly unique, we believe, is that looking at other funds, scale is a challenge, especially looking at projects. Martin also mentioned that it's very difficult to go beyond a few million. So where we believe the institutional cooperation between Rabobank and AGI3 adds value is that we leverage our client base who are active in the supply chain already. So the traders, the brands, the off-takers, and they aggregate farmers. They can act as aggregators and are our conduit to the farmers, because we're not a microfinance institution, so we have to use our client base. And what we do, we factor in AGI3 in existing client conversations that we are already having. And what we do, we look at deals and one-off deals, but more importantly, we also look at programs where we can really scale up in supply chains. And I think that's fairly unique, and that's where we hope to achieve scale and impact for scale. Indeed, looking at the financial return and the environmental return. For that, partnership is key. We've also teamed up with FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, signed up an MOU earlier this year, where we teamed up to basically make food transition more sustainable. So yeah, that's in a way where we try to have a positive impact. What I'd like to wrap up my introduction of AGI3 with is that it's specifically not only intended for Rabobank. AGI3 is an open architecture fund. So Rabobank has started it, but as I also mentioned, the funding gap is that big that we need many, many more banks to partner up with us and to partner up with the fund. So we would like to invite more banks after this year, where we started out the fund, to join the party and to basically build impact for scale together, because we will need all the banks out there and all the pipelines and all the projects and all the clients to work with us to make a positive difference. And really proud and happy that Rabobank set out this initiative. But again, this is really for all commercial banks to join and do create that public-private leverage that we're all seeking for. So hope this clarifies a little bit on where we are, Veronica. And this year we basically were incorporated legally and formally, also closing a few deals already in Brazil and in China. So it's been an interesting ride this year, and hope to continue that, but then with more scale to 2021 and beyond. Back to you, Veronica.
Thank you very much, Hans. Definitely, it's a very interesting value proposition that gives us different investment shades for conserving forests, for increasing agricultural production and food security. That definitely goes beyond commercial lenders, and it also gave us evidence of the innovative financial structures that are currently being tested to really create these assets that are based in nature, but are also needed for the private sector to invest in at scale. And definitely, Hans, we are also happy to join the party. So Simon, I'd like to go back to you. Last month, I remember on the sidelines of the UN General Assembly session, the Global Fund for Coral Reefs was launched as a finance instrument that blends private and public funding to protect coral reefs. Could you please tell us more about this multi-partner trust fund?
Yes, of course. So again, this is another area that's hugely undervalued. So healthy coral reefs are among the most biologically diverse and economically valuable ecosystem on the planet. Today's coral reefs, again, and related ecosystems, again, provide something like $2.7 billion of value, not just in the form of tourism, providing, fisheries, but also importantly in things like coastal protection and actually medicine, which is very valid in the scenarios we find ourselves today. However, they're also, as we all know, significantly under threat, and we've already lost over the last 30 years, significant amounts of coral reefs through bleaching. And going forward over the next 30 years, we're going to lose the same amount again. So we have to quickly take action to basically find a way to invest and support and work with the coral reefs that we have left. So the reefs are being basically battered by overfishing, through pollution and runoff, through unsustainable coastal development, and they're, of course, as we all know, at the frontiers of climate change through rises in temperature and increases in water chemistry. Today, there's no dedicated global funding available for reefs. So the Global Fund for Coral Reefs, which was announced recently, proposes to basically solve that problem. We are looking to support policy, create capacity building, support and invest in innovative businesses, and create innovative finance mechanisms to improve and make reefs more resilient, and importantly, to invest into the associated ecosystems. Now, the fund was going to operate as a blended finance vehicle, and we're going to have a significant grant facility combined alongside it with a private investment facility that will have both a senior capital structure and a junior capital structure. And further, we're working closely with the GCF to provide a GCF funding facility that will be available specifically to support the reefs. So we have this innovative both grant structure and private side financing structure that will basically provide the very dedicated and targeted funding that we need to support reefs going forward. Through this, we will actually bring the right type of finance to the right type of project, and it will allow the GFCR teams to basically structure a range of projects, both, as I mentioned earlier, from capacity or invest into policy, look at marine spatial change, look at creating marine protected areas, but importantly, look at investing into SMEs and other financial mechanisms that supports the communities that basically live off the reef, but also can protect the reefs. We think that this process will also bring with it, and implement type of best practices, transparency, as a byproduct of a successful business. And I think it's important to say that you can't be long-term sustainable if your business is so you can't be green or blue if your business is always in the red or your project is in the red. So to provide long-term sustainability, we need to have a successful business model, and this is what we're trying to achieve through the Fund for Reefs. But it's a coalition of partners. So basically, we're all committed to reef protection, and we're all committed to develop the fund. And this includes Prince Albert Monaco Foundation, the Paul Allen Family Foundation, UNDP, of course, and UNEP, as well as BNP Paribas and ourselves, moreover. So we're looking to design the fund over the next 12 months, and we have a pretty large ambition to raise between the 3 facilities up to $500 million, and spread that through the grant structure, through the private side facility, and with the help of the GCF, so that we can create this fund in 2021 and start delivering the dedicated finance that we believe is needed to protect our resilient reefs.
Thank you very much, Simon. That it's really impressive to see the partnership that you managed to build behind the Global Fund on Coral Reefs, and perhaps just to mention that the GCF is also rapidly increasing its investment in coastal and marine ecosystems protection. Perhaps one example that I could give is the Blue Action Fund project, which is an ecosystem-based adaptation program in the Western Indian Ocean. And it has a GCF grant of around $34 million that is basically supporting climate-focused marine and coastal conservation projects across different countries. And of course, we are very happy to partner with the fund in the future. Michael, I'd like to get back to you. We talk a little bit about Green Fund, that of course it was launched 3 years ago to really prove and test that deforestation-free commodity production can be commercially viable and replicable. Could you please tell us what have you learned from Green Fund and where to go next?
Sure, very happy to. It's a very dangerous question, Veronica, to ask me, because I've learned a number of things, or we learned a lot of things, and I could talk a long time about that. I'm looking at Martin here, who surely also wants to say something, and hopefully we also have some time for the audience. So I'm going to try and be not too long, right? but I would kind of separate the lessons that we have learned in 2 things. We have learned a lot about how we do these investments. And then on the other hand, we also have learned a lot about how we deal with investors, potential investors in the fund. And maybe starting with the investments, I think if you want to play in the sectors that we work, maybe the first lesson we have learned is you have to be relevant for the actors you want to work with. And relevance means to a large extent scale, because, if you want to work with the big soy traders, with the big cattle producers, palm oil plantation companies, if you're providing a loan of $1 million or $2 million, that is just simply not relevant for the effort and the risk also for them to kind of change the business model, because these are finely tuned machines, and finely tuned machines you better don't touch them. So I think that you only touch them if there's real kind of like upside potential in the project. So that's the first thing. I think the second thing we have learned is these investments do take time, and there's a lack of understanding, I think, from all our stakeholders in terms of how much time it takes to do this, because essentially this is not about implementing a project. This is about implementing a change management process within large corporates, large organizations, where maybe someone, maybe the CEO and maybe the sustainability team, they're convinced of what you want to do, but it has to be solved throughout the organization. The commercial teams have to be brought on board, the treasury has to be brought on board, and that process takes time. Particularly takes time if, as a blended finance fund that we are, you come with a lot of restrictions and a lot of requirements in terms of conditions you have to meet. IFC performance standards, that is something most organizations have never heard of about. And we have TA available as well to help companies with that. You know, we have our own TA budget. We have partnerships with UNEP, with the Good Growth Partnership, with WWF, with partnerships for forests. You know, you name them. But you know, it still is a challenge to kind of to kind of educate these organizations and you know, help them meet the criteria that you have. On the one hand, on the other hand, there's also actually a challenge in just simply accessing TA funding. Even if you have partnerships, you know, sometimes in an investment process, the process of getting TA from your TA partner is still a very lengthy process. And I think, you know, that's an area where we can, as a sector, where we can improve. Then there's a confusion at the level of KPIs or at the level of the standards that are applied. IFC performance standards require, in most of the areas where we work, they require what is called net gain, because you know, typically these things happen in critical habitat. But then there's an overlap, but not quite it's not quite the same when you look at the standards that the same project has to apply in terms of, for example, RSPO on the palm oil. You know, HCV, HCS, and critical habitat. Suppose, you know, it's not the same. It's overlapping, but it's not the same. And you know, we have to meet both standards in our projects, but that is really complicated and really difficult also to communicate to the project. And then lastly, maybe, you know, at the level of the institutional frameworks around our projects, for example, in Brazil, one of the challenges we see is that, you know, a lot of organizations are used to subsidized funding. Because there's huge subsidies for agricultural credit in Brazil. And even if you have low cost capital, as Ant Green Fund does, it is difficult to be competitive. And sometimes projects are also comparing apples with oranges a little bit, right? Long-term 15-year financing is not quite the same as a 2-year revolving credit facility, but the interest rate is then compared, and the one is subsidized and the other is not, because if it is subsidized, you couldn't scale it. So that's the challenge on the investment side. Maybe more on the investor side, the biggest challenge for us has been the lack of accessible capital. So, you know, there's a lot of talk around blended finance, but, you know, when you look at who provides blended finance for sustainable land use, who actually provides it and whose capital is actually accessible, I think all of us here on the call, we have been you know, witness to how difficult it is to access that. I think, you know, very good reasons for all the access barriers that there are, but, you know, the access barriers are high and they are difficult to overcome. So that for me is, you know, certainly the first lesson that we have learned, or the first challenge that we are still working to overcome. And then secondly, I think, you know, there's a big challenge on the investor side, particularly when I look at donors. Or multilaterals also, actually, for that matter, you know, an understanding of what scale is. Scale, you know, people ask us all the time, but you already have $127 million in your fund. Why do you need more? You know, that should be enough to kind of fulfill the mission that you have. Why do you have to invest $30 million in a soy trader? You know, that's a big company. That company should be able to do this themselves. So there's a bias towards small projects in this space, I would say, and you know, that is really a barrier to overcome changing these large sectors. You know, soy, palm oil, these are huge multi-billion dollar sectors, and to change them, you can't do that with small investments. And then finally, you know, there's also, and I think I've mentioned that, but I think I want to mention it again. You know, there's a lack of understanding that, you know, change in companies takes time, and change in companies is a process that is not, you know, company is not a homogeneous block. So you can't change the CEO and you can't change the sustainability team. You need to change the entire company. And that's also something that on the investor side, we have seen a bit of as a challenge, because, you know, investors look at the commitments companies have made and they say, well, but they've already committed to that, so this should already happen. So why should we actually support this by providing blended finance for this? But you know, an announcement in a company is not quite the same as then seeing that announcement through. And I've experienced that myself in my corporate career. And I think it's an important understanding that needs to be there, that, you know, the change makers in companies have to be supported as well. That's the highlight maybe of the lessons.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Michael. You mentioned the structuring these novel investments, of course, takes time. You've also highlighted the importance of accompanying the investments with TA. You mentioned that perhaps money is out there, but it's not easily accessible. The gap between the intent of using the funds and the accessibility of funding. But I think what I like to highlight is the importance of corporate governance and the gradual change that needs to really happen within the companies, and not only within the companies, but within the entire sector, right? So Martin, you are our final speaker today. We know that Pollination has recently partnered with HSBC Global Asset Management to create the world's largest dedicated natural capital asset management company. Can you tell us more about it, please?
Yeah, thank you, Veronica. No, with pleasure. So I think the approach that we always look at is, I mean, I talked earlier about the need to move to scale, or everybody here on the panel actually looked at this. And the question for us is, how can we actually achieve the scale? And one option would have been that we would have launched our own fund, for example. But we very quickly realized that that would actually be more challenging probably for us to go for scale. So we were looking for a partner. So back in early March, just before the lockdown, at least in the UK, there was a meeting with HSBC and to, I think, Pollination side, to everybody's surprise, what we heard from HSBC was that there was a really meeting of the mind, that also from their side, they really were of the opinion there's an opportunity to build an investment vehicle of scale to focus on natural capital and also on carbon-related investments. And so we were basically tasked back then, just before the lockdown, to work on an idea. How could this be done? And so this started a process over 4 months. And the interesting story is actually with only one physical meeting, which was just before the lockdown, and then 4 months on Zoom. So this was an entirely the negotiations, even the signature, were done virtually of this joint venture. But what it is actually is that we are now formed a company which is an independent company owned by both HSBC and Pollination. It's called HSBC Pollination Climate Asset Management, and that company will focus on launching large-scale investments vehicles. And the first one we really want to do is to focus on natural capital, and it really tries to fill this gap that I described earlier. We do believe that there's an opportunity to take the impact being more mainstream, or you could say the other way, to actually come more with a forestry/agriculture strategy and bring that more traditional forestry and agriculture investment into the impact world. And that's what we're working on at the moment. We are trying to have a global approach. So it's not only emerging market, it will also be developed markets and emerging markets. And it goes exactly on the kind of the investment strategy that Catherine, for example, described earlier. There is an opportunity to combine, not only to combine impact with return, but actually to achieve a higher return to impact. And that's really the investment thesis we're having. And that doesn't only have to be, let's say, in the Brazilian Amazon. That is also when you look at agriculture in Australia, for example. There are opportunities through better techniques, more sustainable techniques, often focused on water, on irrigation, on clever nutrition, changing of crops, and finding the best value of the best use of the land in order to actually change the use of the land, thereby increase the soil, and not only have an insignificant impact on the ground, but also have a positive financial impact, and then actually achieve a higher return. And that's where we see an opportunity. And this is where, around these themes, we are planning to build a large-scale investment vehicle. We would like to raise €1 million in order to make it attractive for those larger investors. that are really looking for this type of this type of investment sizes. So we're out in the market. We're talking to many projects. We're talking to many investors. We're talking to many partners, because we do believe that, for example, Hans described with the partnerships he formed around the fund. I think this is a great approach. This is exactly what we would like to achieve as well, to work with partners to really make sure that the fund also has the right impact approach. And perhaps that's an important part. Here, what we really see as the unique selling point of this vehicle is to use really the impact not only to select our projects and to define KPIs, but actually also to have a valuation of the natural capital alongside with the financial valuation of the underlying assets. And we believe that's really important, because only if we show that there is a value in nature, and only if we can quantify, we can actually start convincing not only investors, but hopefully also policymakers that we have to take this into account. And that's really the vision we're having with this first vehicle. So I give it back to you, Veronica.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was excellent. So why biodiversity? I think it is clear why investing in biodiversity. We need to transparent the value of investing in nature-based solutions. I would like to thank all our wonderful guests today for having given us concrete examples on how to bring scale to these efforts. Not only scale, but also depth. We know that it's a gradual process, a gradual transformation process. But I think this session has helped us to confirm that nature is definitely an investable agenda. Knowing that the time is short, I would like to take one question from our audience, and you can, to our panelists, perhaps you can tell me if you would like to answer this question. It's the following. So nature-based business models, of course, require expensive investment, and sometimes they get lower profits. And most of the private enterprises, small and medium companies, face a lot of challenges to survive, to ensure that their businesses survive and to really support the long-term life that they need. So what to do? How to really support this long-term perspective of the investees? I don't know. Perhaps Michael, you have.
Yeah, I'm happy to take a first step. I mean, look, for the sectors in which we work, I think the extractive business models, they've kind of run their course, right? And they will come to an end, and you know, therefore the very survival of the businesses that rely on extractive business models is in jeopardy. I think the real tragedy is that at the moment, you know, financing is typically not available for longer term transitions. I mean, typically, for example, for tree crops, you know, growing a tree takes time, but that time is not really aligned with the time it takes, with the time credit is available in the market, right? So either you can finance this yourself as a company, or you can actually not do it. So I think what we try to do is we try to kind of develop financing models that actually allow these sustainable transitions, a transformation towards really kind of regenerative agriculture that can be there in the long time and is kind of in sync with, you know, protection of nature and the resources on which our ecosystem depends.
Thank you very much, Michael. I'm asking again to my panelists if anyone else who would like to mention anything.
Yeah, sure.
Simon.
Yeah, I'd be happy just to take that quickly as well. I'll try and be short, but look, I think again, where we're operating and how we structure funds as a blended vehicle, we can look to address. I think your question was also talking about you know, the return expectations. So I think through a properly structured blended, you know, finance vehicle, we can manage return expectations by making sure that the the right type of financial instrument works for the particular project. So it could be purely debt, or it could have some grant put in place as well as a debt structure, or indeed grant, debt and equity to get the right type of return metrics. Over time, I think there is an absolute recognition by investors, impact managers, that the transition in natural capital needs time and tenor. And so certainly, on our side, the Ocean Fund goes through to 2027. The Global Fund for Coral Reefs will be at least a 10-year fund. And so we recognize that the transition to sustainability needs an investment product that has the ability to work with the company, the sponsors over time, and basically the tenor piece is structured into our transactions.
Veronica, I'm sorry to grab 2 bites of the cherry, but just to say one thing and picking up on what Martin said, the world is changing, the real economy is changing. So the value that is created from more resilient, healthy soil, when you're talking about increase in temperatures, and I'm from a desert country, so maybe that really resonates with me, but that is going to become critical from a risk mitigation and a value creation perspective as well. So it does require longer time horizons, but the world is changing and temperatures are rising. If you've got terrible soil health in Australia, you're less resilient to droughts, and your soil's going to get washed away in the floods. And so there's an acknowledgement and a change both from investors but also from farmers and practitioners who are seeing the value, not just in sort of it's more expensive to do this up front. That's the case often, but the longer term payoffs, we really have to integrate that into our thinking in this space. And so just wanted to pick up on what Martin was saying earlier, that's critical. Otherwise, it's a resilience issue. It's a long-term financing play as well that comes through there. So thanks.
Thank you very much to all of you. We are coming now to an end of this session. And again, I would like to thank you all very much for your interest and for your participation in this session of the conference. We kept around 250 participants over an hour and a half. We really appreciate your commitment. And perhaps I just finish by saying that the pandemic has definitely allowed for this what if moment. And this discussion and exchange has shown the need to really champion the private sector for nature conservation and to really try to unpack the meaning of nature-based solutions. So I would like to thank again the entire organization team who supported us today. Thank you very much. And we also invite you to visit our GCF website to learn about this event, this conference, past events, and also upcoming GCF events. So thank you very much to all of you again, and please stay safe.